Hello and welcome back to Now Read This, the Book of Three by Lloyd Alexander, the first book in the Chronicles of Prydain, Chapter 12, The Wolves. For a time during the day, Taran believed they had at last outdistanced the cauldron born. But late that afternoon, the warriors reappeared from behind a distant fringe of trees. Against the westering sun, the long shadows of the horsemen reached across the hill slope towards the flatlands, where the small troop struggled onward. "We must stand against them sooner or later," Taran said, wiping his forehead. "Let it be now. There can be no victory over the cauldron-born, but with luck we can hold them off a little while. If Eilonwy and Gurgi can escape, there is still a chance." Gurgi, draped over Melingar's saddle, immediately sat up with a great outcry. "No, no, faithful Gurgi stays with mighty lord, who spared his poor tender head. Happy, grateful Gurgi will fight too, with slashings and gashings." "We appreciate your sentiments," said Fluda, "but with that leg of yours, you're hardly up to slashing or gashing or anything at all." "I'm not going to run either," Eilonwy put in. "I'm tired of running and having my face scratched and my robe torn, all on account of those stupid warriors." She jumped lightly from the saddle and snatched a bow and a handful of arrows from Taran's pack. "Eilonwy, stop!" Taran cried. "These are deathless men. They cannot be killed." Although encumbered by the long sword hanging from her shoulder, Eilonwy ran faster than Taran. By the time he caught up with her, she had climbed a hillock and was stringing the bow. The cauldron-born galloped across the plain. The sun glinted on their drawn swords. Taran seized the girl by the waist and tried to pull her away. He received a sharp kick in the shins. "Must you always interfere with everything?" Eilonwy asked indignantly. Before Taran could reach for her again, she held an arrow towards the sun and murmured a strange phrase. She knocked the arrow and loosed it in the direction of the cauldron-born. The shaft arched upward and almost disappeared against the bright rays. Open-mouthed, Taran watched while the shaft began its descent. As the arrow plummeted to earth, long, silvery streamers sprang from its feathers. In an instant, a huge spiderweb glittered in the air and drifted slowly towards the horseman. Fluda, who had run up just then, stopped in amazement. "Great Bellin!" he exclaimed. "What's that? It looks like decorations for a feast." The web slowly settled over the cauldron-born, but the pallid warriors paid it no heed. They spurred their mounts onward. The strands of the web broke and melted away. Eilonwy clapped a hand to her mouth. "It didn't work," she cried, almost in tears. "The way Akron does it, she makes it into a big sticky rope. Oh, it's all gone wrong. I tried to listen behind the door when she was practicing, but I've missed something important." She stamped her foot and turned away. "Take her from here," Taran called to the bard. He unsheathed his sword and faced the cauldron-born. Within moments they would be upon him, but even as he braced for their onslaught, he saw the horsemen falter. The cauldron-born reined up suddenly, then, without a gesture, turned their horses and rode silently back towards the hills. "It worked! It worked after all!" cried the astonished Fluda. Eilonwy shook her head. "No," she said with discouragement. "Something turned them away, but I'm afraid it wasn't my spell." She unstrung the bow and picked up the arrows she had dropped. "I think I know what it was," Taran said. "They are returning to Aron. Gwydion told me that they could not stay long from Anuvan. Their power must have been waning ever since we left Spiral Castle, and they reached the limit of their strength right here." "I hope they don't have enough to get back to Anuvan," Eilonwy said. "I hope they fall into pieces or shrivel up like bats." "I doubt that they will," Taran said, watching the horsemen slowly disappear over the ridge. "They must know how long they can stay and how far they can go, and still return to their master." He gave Eilonwy an admiring glance. "It doesn't matter. They're gone, and that was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. Gwydion had a mesh of grass that burst into flame, but I've never met anyone else who could make a web like that." Eilonwy looked at him in surprise. Her cheeks blushed brighter than the sunset. "Why, Taran of Cerdalban," she said, "I think that's the first polite thing you've said to me." Then, suddenly, Eilonwy tossed her head and sniffed. "Of course, I should have known it was the spider web. You were more interested in that. You don't care whether I was in danger." She strode haughtily back to Gurgi and Melingar. "But that's not true," Terran called. I was—" But then Eilonwy was out of earshot. Crestfallen, Terran followed her. "I can't make sense out of that girl," he said to the bard. "Can you?"
"Never mind," Fluda said. "We aren't really expected to."
That night they continued to take turns at standing guard, though much of their fear had lifted since the cauldron-born had vanished. Terran's was the last watch before dawn, and he was awake well before Eilonwy's had ended. "You had better sleep," Terran told her. "I'll finish the watch for you." "I'm perfectly able to do my share," said Eilonwy, who had stopped being irritated at him since the afternoon. Terran knew better than to insist. He picked up his bow and quiver of arrows, stood near the dark trunk of an oak, and looked out across the moon-silvered meadow. Nearby, Fluda snored heartily. Gurgi, whose leg had shown no improvement, stirred restlessly and whimpered in his sleep. "You know," Terran began, with embarrassed hesitation, "that spiderweb—" "I don't want to hear any more about it," retorted Eilonwy. "No, what I meant to say was, I really was worried about you, but the web surprised me so much I forgot to mention it. It was courageous of you to stand up against the Cauldron warriors. I just wanted to tell you that." "You took long enough getting around to it," said Eilonwy, a tone of satisfaction in her voice. "But I imagine assistant pig keepers tend to be slower than what you might expect. It probably comes from the kind of work they do. Don't misunderstand, I think it's awfully important, only it's the sort of thing you don't often need to be quick about." "At first," Terran went on, "I thought I would be able to reach Caer Dathil by myself. I see now that I wouldn't have even got this far without help. It is a good destiny that brings me such brave companions." "There, you've done it again!" Eilonwy cried, so heatedly that Fluda choked on one of his snores. "That's all you care about? Something to help you carry spears and swords and what all? It could be anybody and you'd be just as pleased. Terran of Caldablin, I'm not speaking to you any more." "At home," Terran said to himself. Eilonwy had already pulled a cloak over her head and was feigning sleep. "Nothing ever happened. Now everything happens. But somehow I can never seem to make it come out right." With a sigh, he held his bow ready and began his turn at guard. Daylight was long in coming. In the morning, Terran saw Gurgi's leg was much worse, and he left the campsite to search the woods for healing plants, glad that Cole had taught him the properties of herbs. He made a poultice and set it on Gurgi's wound. Fluda, meanwhile, had begun drawing new maps with his dagger. The Cauldron warriors, explained the bard, had forced the companions too deeply into the eastward valley. Returning to their original path would cost them at least 2 days of hard travel.
"Since we're this far," Fluda went on, "we might as well just cross Eastrid and follow along the hills, staying out of sight of the Horned King. We'll be only a few days from Caer Dathil, and if we keep a good pace, we should reach it just in time."
Terran agreed to the new plan. It would, he realized, be more difficult, but he judged Melingar could still carry the unfortunate Gurgi as long as the companions shared the burden of the weapons. Eilonwy, having forgotten she was not speaking to Terran, again insisted on walking. A day's march brought them to the banks of the Eastward. Terran stole cautiously ahead. Looking down the broad valley, he saw a moving dust cloud. When he hurried back and reported this to Fluda, the bard clapped him on the shoulder.
"We're ahead of them," he said. "That is excellent news. I was afraid they'd be much closer to us and we'd have to wait for nightfall to cross Eastrid. We've saved half a day. Hurry now, and we'll be into the foothills of Eagle Mountains before sundown."
With his precious harp held above his head, Fluda plunged into the river, and the others followed. Here the Eastward ran shallow, scarcely above Eilonwy's waist, and the companions forded it with little difficulty. Nevertheless, they emerged cold and dripping, and the setting sun neither dried nor warmed them. Leaving the Eastward behind, the companions climbed slopes steeper and rockier than any they had travelled before. Perhaps it was only his imagination, but the air of the land around Spiral Castle had seemed, to Terran, heavy and oppressive. Approaching the Eagle Mountains, Terran felt his burden lighten, as he inhaled the dry, spicy scent of pine. He had planned to continue the march throughout most of the night, but Gurgi's condition had worsened, obliging Taran to call a halt. Despite the herbs, Gurgi's leg was badly inflamed, and he shivered with fever. He looked thin and sad. The suggestion of crunchings and munchings could not even rouse him. Even Melangar showed concern. As Gurgi lay with his eyes half closed, his parched lips tight against his teeth, the white mare nuzzled him delicately, whinnying and blowing out her breath anxiously, as if attempting to comfort him as best she could. Taran risked lighting a small fire. He and Fluda stretched Gurgi out beside it, while Eilonwy held up the suffering creature's head and gave him a drink from the leather flask. Taran and the bard moved a little away and spoke quietly between themselves. "I have done all I know," Taran said. "If there is anything else, it lies beyond my skill." He shook his head sorrowfully. "He has failed badly today, and there is so little of him left, I believe I could pick him up with one hand."
"Caer Dathil is not far away," said Fluda, "but our friend, I fear, may not live to see it."
I love Fluda's voice.
"Caer Dathil."
That night, wolves howled in the darkness beyond the fire. All next day, the wolves followed them, sometimes silently, sometimes barking, as if in signal to one another. They remained always just out of bowshot, but Taran caught sight of the lean, grey shapes flickering in and out of the scrubby trees. "As long as they don't come any closer," he said to the bard, "we needn't worry about them."
"Oh, they won't attack us," Fluda answered. "Not now, at any rate. They can be infuriatingly patient if they know someone's wounded."
He turned an anxious glance towards Gurgi.
"For them, it's just a matter of waiting."
"Well, I must say you're a cheerful one," remarked Eilonwy. "You sound as if all we had to look forward to was being gobbled up." "If they attack, we shall stand them off," Taran said quietly. "Gurgi was willing to give up his life for us. I can do no less for him. Above all, we must not lose heart so close to the end of our journey."
"A flam never loses heart," cried the bard. "Come wolves, or what have you."
Nevertheless, uneasiness settled over the companions as the grey shapes continued trailing them, and Melangar, docile and obedient until now, turned skittish. The golden-maned horse tossed her head and rolled her eyes at every attempt to lead her. To make matters worse, Fluda declared their progress through the hills was too slow.
"If we go any farther east," said the bard, "we'll run into some really high mountains. The condition we're in, we couldn't possibly climb them. But here we're practically walled in. Every path has led us round about. The cliffs, there," he went on, pointing towards the towering mass of rock to his left, "are too rugged to get over. I had thought we'd find a pass before now. Well, that's the way of it. We can only keep on bearing north as much as possible."
"The wolves didn't seem to have any trouble finding their way," said Eilonwy.
"My dear girl," answered the bard with some indignation, "if I were able to run on 4 legs and stiff my dinner a mile away, I doubt I'd have any difficulties either."
Eilonwy giggled. "I'd love to see you try," she said. "We do have someone who can run on 4 legs," Taran said suddenly. "Melangar. If anyone can find their way to Caer Dathil, she can." The bard snapped his fingers.
"That's it!" he cried. "Every horse knows its way home. It's worth trying, and we can't be worse off than we are now."
"For an assistant pig keeper," said Eilonwy to Taran, "you do come up with some interesting ideas now and then." When the companions started off again, Taran dropped the bridle and gave Melangar her head. With the half-conscious Gurgi bound to her saddle, the white horse trotted swiftly ahead at a determined gait. By mid-afternoon, Melangar discovered one pass which Fluda admitted he himself would have overlooked. As the day wore on, Melangar led them swiftly through rocky defiles to high ridges. It was all the companions could do to keep up with her. When she cantered into a long ravine, Taran lost sight of her for a moment, and hurried forward in time to glimpse the mare as she turned sharply around an outcropping of white stone. Calling the bard and Eilonwy to follow quickly, Taran ran ahead. He stopped suddenly. To his left, on a high shelf of rock, crouched an enormous wolf, with golden eyes and a lolling red tongue. Before Taran could draw his sword, the lean animal sprang.
Hey, you want to buy something? You can check the description for my books and audiobooks.
Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content.